Greetings, I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Microbial ecosystems sustain all forms of life, including us, in all environments. However, there are many unknowns about how these diverse and complex communities form, evolve, and survive. The study of microbial ecosystems requires biology and physics and chemistry all combined. Otto Cordero, Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT, is a leader in this very important science. Dr. Cordero will explain why we need to understand and how scientists are investigating microbial ecosystems. He joins us via Zoom from Vienna, Austria. Dr. Cordero, thank you very much for joining us, and a very big welcome to you. I hope you're enjoying Vienna.
Thank you very much. I am enjoying. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'd like to start with a request to explain what these microsystems, microbial ecosystems are. We know about specific bacteria, specific microbes, but we don't usually think about the ecosystems that they exist in, which is so important. If you would, please.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. So I guess the first thing to say is what is an ecosystem in general? Yeah. Most of us have an intuition, right? Plants and little animals that nibble on the plants, and some other animals that eat those animals that nibble on the plants, and so on. Something like that could be an ecosystem. But in general, this can be generalized. It doesn't have to be plants and animals. Living creatures that in one way or another trade in energy or resources to grow and to convert something in the environment into something else. Generally, that's what we call an ecosystem. So it's a loose definition of some conglomerate of species or populations that interact. And then obviously microbial ecosystems would be such a system, but for microbes, and in particular we think of bacteria. There is something else that to the unexperienced eye may seem like bacteria, but this is quite different evolutionarily. It's called archaea. Yes. It's all the type of single-cell organism, little creatures that eat those bacteria and so on. And they, of course, they seem perhaps naively insignificant because they're so small, but they are extremely abundant in the environment, and they're everywhere in the planet. And I guess we'll get into it a little bit more, but they're essential for life.
And yes, I want to make sure that you do bring that up, because we usually think get some spray and get rid of them, but in fact, we absolutely depend on them. And after we're all gone, they will still be there. Is that correct? They have not been extinct.
That's correct. So, and it's somewhat unfortunate that is not very well known. I guess part of the reason is that it's a bit harder to tell a compelling story about the bacteria in the environment. And so, but they are wonderful organisms. The most metabolically diverse creatures in the planet are bacteria. What does that mean? It means that they can obtain energy just from almost all possible sources, and grow from almost all possible chemical ways of generating energy. So for reference, humans or animals like us, we are pretty boring when it comes to metabolism, at least. Of course, we have big brains and we're smarter, we think, but in terms of generating energy, we take things like sugars, and our body burns them with oxygen, essentially. That's how the energy comes about. Whereas these microorganisms they can basically respire rocks, all types of metals, sulfur. They can respire methane. They can produce methane. All these things that are really important for the planet, because they're chemical currencies of the planet, are converted in one way or another by microorganisms like bacteria.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, and we will be more respectful toward these, I think, in the future, because it's slowly getting to be more generally understood that we really depend on this. Life, period, depends on
Yeah.
this. This is the foundation. But one of the most interesting things about your work is you're looking at the ecosystems where you have combined organisms, I guess, and also that you're looking at sort of the physics, the chemistry, the biology, all of these factors that sort of make this possible. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, and of course, there are other people have thought about similar things, but in a way, our journey started because um, we are really early stages of
Yeah,
understanding. I think still ecosystems in general, but obviously microbial ecosystems is a little bit of a newer science, and it has been fueled, so to say, by technology, and specifically the DNA sequencing technology, which I suppose a lot of people in the audience may have heard, because you can sequence your DNA and see who your
right.
ancestors are. That's because it's relatively speaking very cheap to do these days, and so those techniques can be used to study microbes in the environment. That was the onset of sort of molecular microbiology. Before, I don't know, in the 50s, 60s, there were a lot of really good microbiologists, but they didn't have those tools at hand.
Right.
And so it is those tools that allow us to see that the enormous diversity of organisms in soils, in oceans, in the human gut, etc. So now the question becomes, in a way, and this is simplifying things quite a bit, but the question is, well, has become very easy to create these inventories of organisms, let's say in our gut, to come up with something that people perhaps can relate to more easily. But then, how is that a system? Like, how are these
Yes.
organisms interacting with one another? What are the flows of energy and so on, materials and so on? So it is really a challenge, conceptual challenge, how to go from lists of species, those inventories, into something functional
Yes.
that describes how the system works. And doing so requires, we believe, like an integration of modeling, in some way physics, and microbiology, certainly chemistry. And so we perhaps we can talk more about it or not, but we
Yes.
have we have tried to put our efforts also on a specific type of system in the ocean.
Yes. If you would, because
So,
that's, of course, that's a big subject at the moment anyway. We've
right.
just done a program on the issue of mining and the
Aha.
risks in the mining, deep sea mining, and what that's going to do. And again, those researchers emphasize the microbial systems. You cannot mess with this like this. It will be so incredibly disruptive. But I was going to ask you, though, you talked about microbial ecosystems in everywhere, in the gut,
Right.
in plants, and all kinds
Soils
of
and
things, and
ocean,
in
yeah.
the deep sea as well. Whatever it is, do the same principles of ecosystem apply, although you're talking about different microbes and
Yeah.
so on?
Yeah. I mean, we think certainly there are differences. And these differences are, for example, in the chemistry, in the
Okay,
nutrients that are available. Just to give
right,
one
right.
example, I feel like I should give a few more examples just to make things
Yes,
more concrete. For instance, our gut, or the gut of many mammals, is anaerobic. There is no
yes,
oxygen.
yes,
Whereas the surface of the ocean is there's plenty of oxygen. So that creates a very different environment. But then, even within those differences, there are common patterns. And in fact, some of these patterns and processes that are common, they also similar to those that occur with plants and animals at scales way larger than those which are
yes,
microbial.
yes,
For example, the way these ecosystems assemble typically is through successions. Successions, I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with the term, but has been something was described many, many years ago in the context of plant communities. And it's what happens when you say you take your garden, if you have a garden, or any green environment, you clear it. Let's say you burn the piece of land there, and then obviously there won't be any plants, and then you have a succession of species that arrives. First, some weeds, that are
Yes.
hardy and grow very fast. And then that changes the environment. Maybe the soil becomes a bit richer, and then
Yes.
you have other plants that grow in. Eventually, you wait 100 years and you will see big trees, right? So that's the order in which organisms arrive and the ecosystem assembles. And there are a few principles there that I think are common. Like the early arrivers are very good colonizers. They are not very efficient at utilizing resources, but they can grow very fast. And as you progress towards the end, you have species that are much more efficient at sucking up the resources from the environment, but they grow slow. In the case of plants, these are big plants. In the case of microbes, that may be different. But still, the trade-off between efficiency and rate, we think is something fundamental that structures ecosystems in general, whether they're microbial
Yeah.
or plant or animal. Things like that. Something else I can say that I think is perhaps compelling is the incentives, so to say, for organisms to cooperate by sharing resources.
Yes.
In fact, there are analogies even with human societies, I think, in how microorganisms tend to form groups where basically cells kind of cluster next to each other in order to solve complex tasks, like degrading a material that is complex. For example, the shells of certain algae are made of polysaccharides and other polymers that are really hard to degrade. And so microbes need to congregate around them. And in doing so, they can share resources and they manage to solve this task. But if the task is very easy, cooperation is not needed. Rather, they compete. And this is actually something,
It looked good.
this is something that you can see the analogy. These are a few examples. I mean, easy stories to tell, but principles that I think are very fundamental and in fact can connect economics will be my last example, more related to economics and ecology,
Yes.
or the ecology of species of very different types of organisms separated by millions of years of evolution. And because fundamentally all of these units are trading energy and materials in one way or another.
Yes.
And that's what is common between all of them.
Yes, and another thing in terms of like self-organization of these various kinds, many types of ecosystems where you have all sorts of species working together or against each other, but it forms a system. And one of the interesting things is there's no great leader, apparently, in the development of these systems. Self-organizing means it happens spontaneously over time, maybe, or whatever. Is that the case?
Yes, that's the case. And in fact, that's, for example, I think at least one of the fundamental differences between the organization of cells in, let's say, our body, which is a system that is more or less centrally regulated, right? And an ecosystem, which is like organisms that sort of reign in from an environment, and those that are unable to survive, well, they die off, and the ones that can prosper grow, and that changes the environment for other organisms that can come in and grow, and so in that way you get that sort of self-organization.
Yes.
It's quite a bit of like a market that is constantly creating opportunities for other companies, in my poor analogy, to prosper and so on and so forth.
Yes. Okay. So they self-organize, and all for mutual survival. And you mentioned they compete. Also, there's competition and things. They sort of trial and error, I suppose, in some of these microbial ecosystems. But they're just so vitally important. And you have pointed out then that there are some general principles. If you could, do you think there's a way to explain that there are, no matter what the particular ecosystem is, there might be principles of organization, rules, something like that?
Yes. I think there's a way to explain that, of course. But I should say, this whole research agenda is still in early stages.
Yes.
So I don't think we are able to yet say, well, here's the list of like the list of commandments.
Is that one of the ideas though behind it?
Right. I mean, it's ideas, and more than aiming for a list of principles or something like that. I guess a different way to think about this that perhaps is useful is to say, can we, and this is the way, by the way, other forms of other types of sciences that are a bit more mature than biology perhaps have developed, is to say, can we make any predictions?
Yes.
And so in order to make any quantitative predictions, what we need to find is sort of the right variables. Like how do we convert these systems that, because we don't understand them very well,
Yes.
we are forced to describe them in levels of detail that are perhaps too high, like just this list of species, which if you look at them, it would be like a list of Latin names and the abundances of these species with the Latin names. Converting that into something that has a more functional meaning, that says, for example, tells me how I can make functional predictions about the fluxes of materials through systems, the rates of certain processes, and so on and so forth, or the dynamics of the system itself. If we can make those predictions, then we feel like eventually when that happens, that we will have some deeper understanding. But the point is that to make those predictions, we need to find what are the right variables. And in finding these right variables to make the predictions, that's where perhaps the principles come into play.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. Because there is perhaps the best we have so far I think in environmental microbiology at least. You can make pretty good predictions using principles of bioenergetics. What does this mean? So just like I told you before, the certain environments there's a lot of oxygen. Other environments there is no oxygen, but there are other elements that replace oxygen, acting as we call as an electron acceptor. Oxygen is really good at accepting electrons, and that's what allows for the production of energy. But there are other chemical substrates like nitrate or sulfate and so on and so forth, and some metals as well that can accept electrons, but they yield less energy. And so there you have a ladder of energy levels that you can calculate how much energy that will produce, and based on those calculations, you can say whether you can predict whether certain types of metabolism will be present in an environment or not. If there is oxygen and there is some carbon source, you will predict very obviously that there will be some organisms utilizing that. Once the oxygen is exhausted, you will predict nitrate is the next available form of electron acceptor. So then you have organisms that utilize nitrate. There, afterward, the sulfate maybe, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that gives you this cascade. And sometimes if you go to in many places in the world, but in Massachusetts near Woods Hole, there's beautiful salt marshes.
Yes.
You can take a core of the sediment, and it looks like they're colored layers.
Ah.
These colored layers are just different types of
Yes.
metabolism, the microbes that form these pigments, that contain these pigments, rather. And you can see these layers that follow the rules of bioenergetics. So that's an example. It works beautifully. It's wonderful. But it describes things at a certain level, a bit more chemical than biological.
Uh-huh.
And if you want to understand now what species are there and what properties we have, now we need to find other type of principles, hopefully similar to those of bioenergetics, which I use as an example to explain the composition and the dynamics of the system.
Right. Well, you're looking for that kind of, those underlying mechanisms that explain that, right? And I can't resist. I want to talk about your prime organization, but before that, I'd like to ask you about your background. You have in artificial intelligence and I guess a lot of mathematics and stuff. Has that informed this work at all, or is it useful?
Yes, very much. And perhaps surprisingly, I don't know, but not so much the artificial intelligence background. I mean, it's there and it's useful more than artificial intelligence, I say computer science. But I did my PhD and this was it was serendipitous. It was in mathematical biology or theoretical biology.
This sounds like it.
Right, and that's a very unique way of thinking, and specifically the type of theoretical biology that was practiced in the Netherlands, in Utrecht. That it's a kind of type of science that is almost like dying off, unfortunately. But it inspired me, and it inspired everybody that went through that group that it was led by Pauline Hogberg. Is a wonderful thinker, professor, and pioneer of mathematical biology in Europe and the world probably. Inspire us to think about biological systems in a different way.
Yes.
To think of them, for example, as computational systems that
Yes.
that process information in a way, and to think about that in that level of in a way a bit of a higher level of abstraction, less focus on trying to disentangle
Right.
necessarily molecular
Right.
mechanisms,
Right.
thinking
Right.
about making connections with the world and so on, and then obviously using whenever possible the tools of mathematics or computation to try to understand them. And there is a long history of this, by the way. It's just that it's not super well known.
Yes, I didn't know that it was well known at all, but it seems so, shall I say, fundamental. And this is from an outside point of view here. I'm
Yeah,
not certainly an
sure.
expert, but it just seems like, oh, if you could get that, you could explain a whole lot of phenomena, and certainly the ecosystems things.
I think there is also, I feel like biology is a little bit. Sometimes I feel like people ask a lot from biology.
Yeah.
It is and that doesn't leave space sometimes for the fundamental
Right,
research,
yes.
fundamental questions.
Yes.
Because to give a very, in a way, almost like personal example, every time I talk about a little bit what I do, I feel like, especially in Cambridge, people are coming and asking, okay, and what do you do with that? What disease are
do you do with it? What on earth?
So the expectation is that there has to be a biomedical application,
right, or an economic
slash,
application or something or other. Yes.
right, / startup.
Yes.
And this is great. I mean, right. So, which is frankly, I mean, like, there's a lot of short-term financial incentives behind the research that is done in biology, and I mean, it's all fine, right? But there in a way there should be much more focus, I think, on the fundamental
Yes.
aspects of I mean, such a extraordinarily mind-blowing thing that is life.
That's right, exactly. And you need something to get at that real fundamental level. It's very exciting what you're doing. So this leads me to ask you about PRIME, and I'll ask you to explain the acronym. This is not associated with Amazon. I'd like the audience to know. So if you would please tell us, that is so exciting, and we just have, like 5 minutes left, so I'd like to get that in. Yeah.
So PRIME was started in 2017 with support from the Simons Foundation. This is Jim Simons, mathematician and
what's the
investor?
Yeah, could you explain the acronym itself? Yes, if you would.
Sorry. So PRIME started in 2017 with support from the Simons Foundation. PRIME stands for Principles of Microbial Ecosystems. That is the ME from PRIME. Had nothing to do with Amazon.
Right.
It is a consortium of now 10 different research groups.
Wow. And it's around the world, isn't it?
Right. Some on the west, on Southern California, in Caltech and USC. There is from the University of Georgia.
MIT.
Georgia is the United States. MIT and ETH Zurich in Switzerland, as well as the Max Planck Institute in Bremen. And so, of course, not to forget UCSD, University in San Diego. Yes. So, and then 10 research groups distributed across these institutions, but especially when we designed the collaboration, we put a special focus in integrating some of the best in our view, of course, physicists that biology and microbiology in particular. We have marine microbiologists, people that are specialized in studying polysaccharides in the ocean, because this is one of the main sources of carbon and energy for microorganisms in the ocean. We have people that have sophisticated techniques to study the metabolites, the chemical currencies inside the cell. And so people that do physics of search, of how microbes search their nutrients in the ocean, and and all this type of thing. So that was the vision, right? To create this sort of consortium that of people that can exchange resources and ideas, and also to train a new generation of scientists and across disciplines,
Yes, yes.
and with a focus on these big ideas of like, the big aspiration, I should say, of trying to identify those principles, or perhaps more specifically those simple variables that could help us describe a microbial ecosystem, so that we can make quantitative predictions. And like I said, it started in 2017, so now, and we will continue until 2027 at least. And so we have trained in the order of 40, 50 people so far, and some of them already have faculty jobs in the
Yes,
US and in Europe.
right.
So it's a very exciting thing, and we meet in person once a year in New York, and it's one of the highlights of my year,
I
the meetings.
bet. I bet. Well, I think this is very interesting in the sense that it reminded me right off of like a smaller version of the Large Hadron Collider, where you have this huge international community, but you need all this variety of fields that contribute. They're not all doing the same thing. And this is a trend, it looks like, in a number of areas of science, certain fundamental things, especially, that's my sense, but that you're putting brains together. You are an ecosystem. Did you know that?
Actually, that's true.
But it's this variety that makes it work. And I thought, what an interesting idea with this. And so is that true that you're an ecosystem? First, that wasn't an accusation.
Yeah, I guess you can see it that way, yes, and hopefully one that cooperates mostly.
Right. And so you are all working toward this goal of uncovering these all the variables, all the principles, and so on,
in different ways,
fundamentals.
and then also thinking how to put it together in ways that are useful for the community, for the marine microbial community,
Yes.
and focusing especially on the carbon cycle
Yes.
in the ocean, so
Yes.
everything is contextualized in that way. And so, yeah, we have also generated a lot of different resources for the scientific community of microbiologists who study the ocean. And so yeah, the impact is varied, right? So of course our aspiration is these big ideas, but we also have a lot of very concrete impact on the community, on the scientific community.
Right. One more question before we go is that this looks like a way to train future scientists, that this is providing a direction, a base, and people who have committed. Is that true? Do you anticipate that you'll be training another generation to look at this very differently, like you have?
That's a big aspiration, and I mean, obviously, as a professor, as a scientist, my job is to
Yes.
train people in my lab and so on, and I mean, it's still still relatively early in my career to say what impact will that eventually have, but that's the vision, and but it's not an easy thing, because there are a lot of barriers. Like as I was saying, for example,
understand,
that focus on biomedical applications,
Right.
because I think it's great in its own, but
Right.
to redefine the way we think about microbiology in particular, yeah, I mean that's probably the aspiration of any professor or scientist, to have an impact in that way.
Well, I bet you anything that there's going to be an impact. It sounds very, very interesting, of course, but it's a new direction. It's an important direction, surely. Even an outsider can see that. Dr.
very much.
Cordero, we must leave, but I really appreciate your giving us your expertise here and your time. Thank you ever so much, and the best of luck with this
Thank you very
project.
much. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.